We're trying to get a feel for how people spend their day at work. So, if you would you walk us through a typical day for you?
Yeah.
Great.
Well, I generally come in at least 15 minutes late. I use the side door. That way Lumberg can't see me. And after that, I just sort of space out for about an hour. Till I'm finished.
Space out?
Yeah. I just stare at my desk. But it looks like I'm
cube designing.
I do that for probably another hour after lunch, too. I'd say in a given week, I probably only do about 15 minutes of real, actual
cube design.
Peter, would you be a good sport and indulge us and just tell us a little more?
Oh, yeah. Let me tell you something about TPS reports.
TPS stands for...
The thing is, Bob, it's not that I'm lazy. It's that I just don't care.
Think so?
All right. Anthony, you're good? Sure. We're diving into it then. Hi, everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony. You can't be wrong about cards in your cube if you never add new cards to your cube, Maddox.
It's a really great strategy.
Yeah.
It's going to pay off wonders right here.
I'm excited for this episode. I wanted to do this last year, but then Wizards changed the standard rotation cycle and robbed us of this episode last year. So it's been 2 years since we've done a retrospective standard rotation episode where we look back at the sets that have rotated out of standard, which I gotta say is a good time to buy cards if you have been holding off on your cube, because a lot of these prices for standard playable cards will tank a little bit. And look at the cards that we were wrong about from our respective set surveys. Do you even submit set surveys for your cubes?
This is embarrassing, but it has been a little while since I've been on top of that. I've just not been as much into updating my cube. We got lots of cube activities happening constantly, and updating your cubes is one of the fun things that you can do, but there's also other things that I've been focusing on, so, oops, I'm sorry.
Well, so just so this isn't me monologuing about cards that I've been wrong about, we have Parker. I actually didn't think of a nickname for you, Lamascus, on the line. I only realized right as I went to say your name, I hadn't thought of one. I'm sorry, Parker. Parker, too big for a nickname, Lamascus.
Parker, lost in the Python sauce, Lamascus.
Absolutely. Yes, I was also very wrong about cards, so it won't just be you, Andy.
Yeah, I think it's inevitable. It's just funny the ways in which you're wrong about cards, Parker has written a beautiful article for the 2024 Standard Rotation Cube Retrospective. This is something we get requests for pretty often when we do our prospectives, which is whenever a new set comes out, we write a little article, do a survey about the cards people are most excited about, and people rightfully so point out, hey, when do you ever look back on this and see if people were right or wrong, or maybe do a retrospective so we can hear with more time and experience what cards people remain excited about from these sets in their cubes. And we chose to do it at standard rotation. So we had to pick a time to do it, and this allows us to do a bunch of sets all at once instead of having kind of an ongoing 2-year offset string of retrospectives at the exact same pace as Wizards of the Coast's breakneck release schedule. Instead, we just do this basically once a year. We look back at the survey results both for the entire cube world in the aggregate and also our own personal cubes and see what we have changed our minds on from our ratings of the surveys in sets prior. Parker, what do you want to say about this article? I think it's great. Everyone should definitely go read it. It is a really interesting perspective into the cards that we as cube designers are most often wrong about.
Yeah, our approach is really to just follow up on all of the cubes that sent us survey submissions in the past. So we've got the receipts, and we can then check up on each of our respondents and say, okay, you provided your cube list in the past. You provided your testing list for a set like Innistrad Midnight Hunt, which is the oldest set that's rotating, up to Commander Legends Battle at Baldur's Gate, which is not rotating exactly, but also falls within this time window. So we're going to see how many cards from each of those sets you're still testing based on the cube list that you provided back in the day. And so the article is really the summation of that. Today on this episode, though, we're mostly going to talk about our own cubes. What I'd like to do is once we get to kind of summing up the lessons that we've learned this year, then I'll bring in a little bit of the lessons that I've learned from looking at the entire community's data. And we can do that all at once.
Yeah, I think the article is definitely the best venue, the best format for the broad statistics, because it has a detailed table that lets you explore all of the 1,000 cards basically in this standard cycle. And you can see exactly how the play rates have changed, both amongst people we've surveyed and people that just have a cube on Cube Cobra in general. So it's much easier for you to just go explore that if that's what you care about. So we're going to kind of reference that here, but I think, again, as Parker mentioned, mostly talk about our own experience in terms of cards that we have changed our opinions about. And these will kind of fall into a couple categories. So obviously, Parker and I, and occasionally Anthony, whenever he deigns to bless us with a survey submission, filled out surveys for our primary and also secondary and tertiary cubes for all of these sets and rated all the cards we were interested in on a scale from 1 to 10 in the typical style. So cards you could be wrong about fall into a couple categories. One category is a card that you rated very highly and then ended up not continuing to play. I rated this a 10 or a 9, and now a couple years later, I'm not even playing it anymore. Another way you can be wrong, obviously, is rating a card very lowly, but still playing it. So I rated this, a 1 or a 2, but I am still playing it, in fact, multiple years later, so wasn't quite right about that. And then the third category is kind of the most stark one for me, which is a card that you didn't even rank at all. You didn't even have it on your radar. You didn't even give it a 1. I'm going to give it a shot that you are now solidly committed to. And there's quite a few in this category for me as well. So a lot of nuanced ways in which we can be wrong we'll be unpacking here on this episode.
Yeah, and I do want to point out that it's not uncommon for these cards to be seeing less play over time. For an example, and I cite this in the article, but I said I would test 23 cards from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. I think it was my favorite set of this time period, personally, and I wanted to test 23 cards in my cube, the Ship of Theseus. And now, 2 years later, I'm still playing only 9 of them. And it's not that I cut 14 of them for reasons of power level or that they weren't fun to play with. I mean, in some cases, I never even picked up the card. I just couldn't find anybody who would trade.
How quaint that you are still trading in the year 2024.
Well, trying to support the LGS.
No, I'm jealous. I love trading. It's just, I feel like it happens so rarely now with the way everybody plays the game. It's rare. It's unlikely you'll find somebody that actually has extra cards they're not using that you want that you can actually trade for. So I'm jealous.
Yeah, and that does make it hard to pick up a card like Odawara Soaring City, which saw modern play and suddenly became like a $30 card. And I wanted to test it. I just never found somebody willing to trade me. And I didn't care enough to buy it at that point. So, sometimes I just never pick up the card. Sometimes I do pick up the card, I play it for a little bit, but then I cut the artifact archetype out of my cube because I got bored of that. And so a lot of support pieces from Neon Dynasty that were for the artifact deck no longer had a home. It's not their fault, I just got bored. And then in other cases, I just cut cards because I was trimming the overall cube size. And there are a few cards on that list that are only victims of the size of the cube going down. So those are just some examples that aren't at all related to the play pattern or the power level of these cards. It's just kind of the whims and vicissitudes of being tested in cube. So in other words, the odds are stacked against any single card seeing more play as a function of time here. So yeah, those cards that we do overlook and end up feeling really positive about are often quite exceptional.
We've also talked in the past about how sometimes you've just sort of played enough with a card, and not like that was a bad card or problematic in any specific way, but you've just seen it and play enough and you're ready to do something new, which is, I think a big part of the fun of Cube is that you get to sort of opt into what kind of experience you're looking for.
I definitely, over time, have just rated every card more lowly. In the early days of the survey, I was much more sort of evenly distributed amongst the 1 to 10 range, basically. Like the cards I liked the most were all 10s and 9s, and the cards I was least excited about but curious about were all 1s and 2s. And having done this for many years now, and also done these retrospectives for a while, and looked back at my own survey submissions for quite some time, I have come to realize that, yeah, like Parker's mentioning, cards are really not that likely to stick in your cube. To give something a 10 now, I need not only for it to be a card that is 100% in line with all of my goals and really with no downsides. And we'll cover cards that I thought were this but ended up not being this in our specific set-by-set review. But also cards that are not part of categories of cards that are likely to just get usurped by new, more interesting options. I'll give a couple examples here from the oldest set we're talking about, which is Innistrad Midnight Hunt. in that survey, I rated Play with Fire a 10, which in hindsight, I should never have done because, of course, they're just going to keep printing new, cool shock variants, right? To ever give any shock variant a 10 these days, it would be inconceivable to me because it would have to be like the perfect shock variant that would be like the top of the list. Where Play with Fire is just a very marginal upside that I just cut after playing with it a little bit because it wasn't really doing a whole lot. By comparison, though, consider I rated a 10 in that survey, and I still would call consider a 10 today. It's like middle to top of the pack of the cantrips that I do include in the cube. So they'd have to print like 5 or 6 one-mana cantrips that are better than or more interesting than or more in line with my goals than consider for me to be interested in cutting consider. So I just definitely, there's a much higher bar for me now to give a card a very high rating than there used to be, even in the sort of, early years of this standard rotation, which we're going to talk about.
Are there other types of cards that don't fit that mold that you think like, oh yeah, this is something that is really, really unique and not likely to be, have similar cards competing for it in the near future?
It's really hard to give those a high rating, though, because very oftentimes I also don't have a lot of confidence in what the play patterns are going to be.
Sure, that's a great point,
because there's less to compare it to. So for those two reasons, it's really hard for me to rate a card super highly, because if it's a really known quantity, then it probably belongs to a category of cards that we are likely to continue to get more options for, which means that there's just going to be more things competing with that card for long-term status in the cube. And if it's a card that's like totally unique and we're not going to get anything that competes with it, then how good am I really going to be at evaluating it prior to playing with it a bunch? So for those reasons, yeah, I occasionally give things a 10. I gave Fell recently a 10, and I feel pretty strongly about Fell sticking around in my cube for a very long time, but it's much more rare now for me for sure. So let's sink our teeth into Innistrad Midnight Hunt. This was a hugely popular set for Cube in general. Lots of responses on our survey, lots of high ratings, lots of people testing lots and lots of cards. My biggest misses from this set are, A, rating a bunch of things very highly. I have 5 tens that I'm not playing anymore in this set. Those are Fateful Absence, Bloodthirsty Adversary, Falcon Wrath Pit Fighter, Play with Fire, and Primal Adversary. All cards I thought would be windmill slams for the far future, and a lot of these didn't even last that long in the cube. It's not like I cut these last month, right? I haven't been playing these for quite some time. So that's one of my biggest misses from this set. It's just rating everything a little too highly. I think this was still before I had recalibrated my sensors to have a much higher bar for a high rating. The other sort of biggish miss is I did have Augur of Autumn on this survey, but I had it rated quite low at 1.9. And today, this is a card I feel pretty strongly about in the Bun Magic Cube, in that I think I even said during the set review that it's like a kind of evened off Prophet of Krufix. A Prophet of Krufix can be a huge nightmare for an aggro deck as this like 2/4 that gains life. If you don't have a way to get rid of a 4 toughness creature, it can really be a big block. But also against, other kinds of decks, it provides this very conditional card advantage, which is maybe not always the most impactful. Meanwhile, Augur of Autumn is less of a roadblock against aggro decks, but provides more of that card advantage because you can also get to that Coven and start casting creatures off the top. So this is a card I do really like. I like having access to things that can provide card advantage, but don't do it every single time they're cast in like a Muldrifter style way, specifically in mid-range green decks. So that's another card I was pretty wrong about. The two biggest misses here, though, for me by far, I did not even rate Adeline Resplendent Cathar. And I remember talking about it at the time and being like, oh, this is like Brimaz, maybe a little better, maybe a little worse. And in reality, it is so much better than Brimaz. It's not even close in comparison to Brimaz. And it's a card I feel very strongly about now. And it's one of my few big game cards where I'm happy to have a card that makes a ton of tokens, makes a huge board state. I'm famously kind of against really big, complicated board states, specifically in my Bun Magic Cube. But Adeline just ticks every single box in a way that I'm very happy to have that be one of my few cards that sort of points to that kind of gameplay. And it is kind of hard for me to imagine that card being unseated as I sit here today. Like, if I was to rate this card today, I would give it like an 8 or a 9, which is a very high rating in terms of how likely I think I am to continue to play Adeline. There's one other card I didn't rate here, which is actually a relatively recent addition to the Bun Magic Cube, which is the Meathook Massacre. A card that I didn't...
But that gains life, Andy.
It does.
Do you know
life.
that?
I know that it gains life, and I include that card right now specifically as a nod to a control deck. I want more cards in black that really strongly push control decks. I don't have anything resembling an Aristocrats deck in this cube. There is nothing else that allows you to, play Grave Crawlers over and over again, or make a ton of tokens and sacrifice them. There's no Goblin Bombardment, no Blood Artist, none of that stuff. So Meathook Massacre's life gain here is really not going to be in a deck that's also full of creatures that it's going to constantly be sacrificing to just make this grindy engine. It's just going to be in a control deck, and it's going to give you another access to a very appealing board wipe that also then has sort of a long-term, trickle of life gain on your continued removal spells, where you can keep your opponent's board clear and just slowly bleed them dry a little bit. I would not rate that one very highly sitting here today. I'm not sure what I would call that. Maybe like a 4. If a more interesting board wipe comes along, I could definitely see playing it over the Meathook Massacre, because that's actually one of those cards that fits into that category you were describing, Anthony. It is pretty unique. Like, there really is nothing quite like the Meathook Massacre that is a board wipe and also this sort of ongoing blood artisty style attrition effect. So those are the things that actually keep me excited about it. Like, for example, there's this new kind of Toxic Deluge Delirium variant in the new set, which a lot of people are excited about, which I can't see myself running because it is so similar to Toxic Deluge, and for my goals, less of a good fit than Toxic Deluge. Massacre is very unique. It's not like Toxic Deluge. It's not like Damnation. It's kind of its own thing, and I like that about it. So that is what's currently keeping it in my cube, despite the repeated life gain and potential feel bads. And those are my misses from Midnight Hunt. What about you, Parker?
Well, I think my biggest miss was I also didn't test Adeline, and now I'm on it. I wouldn't call it an 8 or a 9 if I were to rate it today. I think I'd probably rate it a 6 or 7. Like, I'm really playing it because it's a good collected company target.
And this is in Ship of Theseus, correct? Just to clarify?
Yeah. Yeah, it's in my higher power Eternal Cube, the Ship of Theseus. And I play 3 collected companies there. It's a fun deck, and it does need 3 drops in order to kind of hit that mass of good targets. So Adeline does a good job there, but I wouldn't call her irreplaceable, and I'm not necessarily even in love with her play patterns for other reasons. But nonetheless, I didn't say I would test it at the time, and so that I think that's an error. The other main error that I wouldn't call it an error, but the other miss that I have is that I rated Arlen the Pax Hope as a 9.5. This is the double-sided Planeswalker that has the Daybound Nightbound ability, and at the time I didn't really think that would be very onerous, and so it was the only card I was testing with that ability. And I thought to myself, well, this is a very flavorful and mechanically pleasing Planeswalker, and so I'm just going to play it, and people can get over that complexity. It turns out it wasn't as easy to get over as I thought, number one. And number two, Daybound Nightbound also acquired a little bit of a sour taste in people's mouths from Standard, Pioneer, and just like the rest of the Magic world.
I mean, especially I think in Commander, if you're trying to build a werewolf deck and you have multiple different kinds of werewolves that function slightly differently, that was really kind of a mess, to be honest.
Still surprised they did that, given that Commander is such a big focus for all their set design. Yeah. I would have thought that problem would have kept Daybound Nightbound from being printed in the first place, even though in a vacuum I think it is a better implementation of that sort of werewolf mechanic.
I agree. It is really weird, but then also Arlen was in the same mana value as Huntmaster of the Fells, which for my money is one of the most evocative and appealing and good play pattern mid-range threats of all time. And it uses the other template of Werewolf. And so if I had to choose between one of the two templates, I'm going to choose the card that already has a sense of nostalgia, a sense of history, and I've already, loved playing with for years.
It's also inherently self-contained, which Daybound Nightbound technically requires you to just keep on tracking it, even if that card's left play, which, yes, it works in a self-contained sense, but it feels much more like it's encroaching onto the entire game with its mechanic instead of just being on one card.
Yeah, there is that. I think that argument has been overblown in the Cube world, but it's not nothing. Yeah, so those are my bigger misses from Innistrad Midnight Hunt.
We do have the comments also available in our retrospective tool that lets you review your past surveys. And that was my one comment about this set, was that I liked Arlen and specifically Outland Liberator quite a bit, but was worried that Daybound Nightbound would be really onerous and a bummer in small doses. And I think that definitely turned out to be true, at least for me.
I mentioned it too, and I said I'm reluctant to test small numbers of them. And yet I evidently thought Arlen would be cool enough to be worth it, and it wasn't. Anthony, did you make any misevaluations for Midnight Hunt?
Do you want to say anything about anything?
Sure, yeah. I mean, one card I'll point out that I put into regular cube kind of skeptically was Audric's Outrider. This is a 4 mana, 2/4, and whenever another creature dies, you can put a counter on another creature you control. This is just like a 4 mana white creature, is not necessarily something that I want a lot of in this cube, so I put it in kind of skeptically. But it's actually been kind of a fun, like, combo-y card. There isn't a lot that's really combo-y in this cube at all, so it's kind of fun to kind of discover it occasionally. It's like, oh, I'm in this token deck, and now here's another way to sort of make use of those tokens. So that's something that I've actually been enjoying more than I expected to. There's also some fun kind of like dorky cards for the Turbo Cube from this set that I definitely just enjoy having, like the Jack-o'-lantern and the Moonsilver Key. Stuffed Bear is another card that I'm kind of like on the fence about in the Turbo Cube because essentially it's just a 0 mana 4/4, which is, on one hand, that sounds like super broken, but then actually you're doing so much more broken stuff in the Turbo Cube that it's actually not that cool. So like,
Yeah, 0 mana 5/7. What is Mirror Superior? It's big.
I think that's a 5/4.
5/6.
5/6. So yeah, I mean, these cards are like, on one hand, kind of like less powerful than you think they are. I do appreciate the like fun read of Stuffed Bear. The thing that's actually just sort of keeping it around for me is that a couple people have tried to sort of do these interesting decks where they're just playing as many free creatures as they can and then counter spells and using that as like, here's a way that I can disrupt your plan while actually having some way to win the game. So that's what's keeping Stuffed Bear around for me. But yeah, it's sort of funny how there's like a lot pulling me in different directions with this card.
Is it worth talking about Crimson Vow Commander? I mean, I thought Occult Epiphany was kind of cool, and it turned out to actually not be as powerful as I thought, but I would not count that as a thing I was substantially wrong about. I was medium on it, and it turned out to be worse than I thought, and I am no longer playing it. But is there anything else worth talking about, you think, from the Commander set?
The Commander sets are actually a win for me in this time period because I decided that I would play much less Commander cards. I was able to kind of redefine Theseus as a cube where it's really trying to play with cards that have gone through Standard a lot, or at least have seen significant competitive play. In other words, it's meant to be an on-ramp to Cube, not from a new Magic player perspective or an EDH player perspective, but from a like competitive player who played some Magic online and maybe is like disillusioned with Commander cards coming into Legacy or whatever. And so it's meant to be kind of comfort food for that kind of player. And for that reason, I no longer needed to care about the Commander sets as much for this cube. And that's been both liberating to my time and energy, but also I think just realigning my card evaluation with my cube's goals. In other words, I don't need to talk about these anymore.
Great. Me either. Let's move on to Innistrad Crimson Vow, then, the sister set to Midnight Hunt. Scrolling through my survey archive, this is one of the sets I think I did the best job at. There were 9 cards I was considering testing. The top 4 I'm still playing. The bottom 5 I am not playing anymore. With one big exception. My very top card here was rated a 10. I am no longer playing it, and it's Dreadfugue. And this is a great example of a card that mechanically, power level wise, is still perfect in this cube, right? Would still be a total 10. The fact that my curve is so low and hand disruption is a thing I prioritize so highly, for all those reasons, it's a 10. I'm not playing it anymore purely because Cleave is just a bummer. It is just turned out to be like feel bad, and it's like you have to read it twice, I feel like, every time to remember exactly what it does. And I purely just cut it because I was like, you know what, I can afford to have more cards that fit my goals in terms of simplicity and clarity of text, and fewer cards that fit my goals in terms of strict game pieces and how they interact with the board and mechanics of the game. But aside from that, I kind of nailed this set, and there's nothing I think particularly notable within my survey results.
Yeah, I also did a fairly good job with Crimson Vow. I didn't even test Dreadfugue, and I'm proud of that. You know, it was, again, part of this kind of streamlining of what my cube is meant to be. It's not a maximalist cube. It's not meant to showcase, you know, the best card with every mechanic from Magic's history. No, it is instead just like elegant and classic effects and kind of dialing up that nostalgia and dialing down mechanical novelty. So I never even said I would test Dreadfugue, which bore out as something that I really liked. I did miss on Cemetery Gatekeeper, which is like a little bit of graveyard hate, a little bit of like Hate Bear in red. And It's not a piece that I think is essential to this list, but it's certainly been fun. I would rate it maybe a 7 or 8 with hindsight, Otherwise, Crimson Vow, I think went pretty smoothly. It's worth noting that this set had about 5 survivors on average among our survey respondents. So not as many as Midnight Hunt, which had 8 survivors at the median, and not as many as Neon Dynasty, which also had 8, but still a pretty relevant set for many of our survey respondents 2 years later. 3 years later. Oh my goodness.
I don't like thinking about time.
I think one of the most interesting things actually that this set brought us was blood tokens, which is a weird thing that I think the flavor was kind of a miss, but they're mechanically just really, really interesting components. So I wonder if we're going to see those again. It's interesting to see that the 2 cards that most increased in play, that, overall the community underestimated how much they would be interested in putting them in their cubes, both create blood tokens, the Blood Tithe Harvester and the Voldaren Epicure. So I wonder if we're going to see a return of that at some point, and how the cube community would respond to more blood tokens.
Have we not gotten more blood tokens in the interim?
Oh, have we not? I mean, have we? It's hard to keep track of all the things that are being made.
It feels like we have, but maybe I'm wrong.
I honestly don't know. I don't think so. A big feature of those 2 blood cards, because they're far from the only blood token creators in this set, but they are the 2 that saw the most standard play and even pioneer play. Part of me thinks that obviously the constructed world is a great place for cube curators to get feedback. You can watch a streamer play with a card that you're considering testing, but it's $50 and you're not sure you want to commit that much or whatever. You can play with it yourself on Arena and get 10 games in using a card that you might test for your cube in the same amount of time that you could fire 1 draft, and somebody might not even draft that card in your cube, and you have to put all that logistics together. So what I'm saying is Standard and Pioneer, I'm starting to think, are testing grounds for cube considerations, especially among the kind of player, the kind of cube curator who responds to a survey where they don't get anything out of it. There's no prizes or we're not paying people to fill out these surveys. So the people who fill out our survey are the people who are always thinking about cube, the most engaged Magic players often. And those are also the people who might benefit from seeing these cards in their constructed environments.
Next up is Neon Dynasty, and this is the set that by far still has the biggest impact on my cube from this standard rotation. I'm playing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 cards from this set in my cube currently, which is the biggest number, not close, of all these sets we're talking about today. I did an okay job here. My big misses are, 1, I rated Eater of Virtue a 10, and I'm no longer playing that card. I may still be on Bone Splitter. I actually don't know off the top of my head, but this is a great example of all that complexity proved to just not be worth it. And more often than I expected, Eater of Virtue exiling the card when it died was a huge downside for the deck playing it. It was just, you wanted the card in your graveyard for Delirium or to reanimate or whatever, and now you just didn't have that anymore, and instead you had this extraordinarily minor upside on your Bone Splitter that also has a paragraph of text on it. Hindsight 2020, I don't know why I rated that a 10. I'm not sure what I was thinking at the time, but that was something I was pretty wrong on here.
I know that particular point was definitely discussed a lot, that people were unsure how much of a downside that would be, so it's interesting to hear it pan out that, yeah, it really did take away from a lot of games.
Then the next thing that stands out to me here is I rated Lion Sash pretty highly. I gave it a 7.75 on this survey, but today I would call this card a 10. I think this card is perfect. It's probably my favorite card from this entire set, and I don't see myself cutting that card anytime soon. The sort of various options there for it to be a threat that can just take over the game all on its own. If I can play this against my primarily red opponent and just get it to 4 or 5 toughness, then it can just carry a whole game. The fact that you can reconfigure it onto a creature to make it safe from board wipes and other targeted removal is huge. The Grave Hate and sort of option to just use that to manage your opponent's Delirium or keep them off delve threats or shut off cards like Snapcaster Mage. It's just a perfect little toolbox, and I actually just got totally wrecked by this card at the finals of Boston Cube Party by my opponent, who I just couldn't beat it. I was trying to Snapcaster Mage my Time Walks and Ancestral Recalls, and this little old Lion Sash just carried the whole day for them. So that's a card I'd rate much more highly now. The other 2 things I was wrong about here, I didn't even rank March of Otherworldly Light, and this is a removal spell I now feel pretty strongly about. It's not the most efficient, and I almost never use the alternative casting mode where you can exile weight cards from your hand. I instead just kind of treat it as a worst prismatic ending, but being able to hit more than just creatures, like also artifacts and enchantments, has proved really important, specifically for control decks that otherwise have a big problem against Retrofitter Foundry, Smuggler's Copter, Sylvan Library, that kind of stuff. So this is not the most efficient card, but I love the art. I think the art is so cool on really both printings of the card. And also, it plays a unique and important role, specifically for more controlling decks, that I think it's going to stick around for a while. My biggest oversight, which is everyone's biggest oversight from this set by far, is I didn't even rank Fable the Mirror Breaker. I can say, honestly, it was not even on my radar as a powerful card. I thought, okay, sure, it makes a couple 2/2s, whatever. And now, obviously, it's proven to be a much more powerful card than the vast majority of players thought at initial printing. I'm a Fable the Mirror Breaker defender. This became kind of a meme because Sam Black, specifically in a tweet or an article or somewhere, said that he sees people constantly putting Fable the Mirror Breaker in their cubes because it has synergy with artifacts or discard, and he thinks it's so silly that people do that because it's actually just a broken power outlier and the synergies don't matter. I kind of don't agree with that take. I would so much rather have my power outliers have some synergy to them. And sure, is it going to go in my deck regardless of how much discarding or how much artifact stuff I have? It is, because it's really powerful. But if your cube is trying to encourage those synergies, I think it's great that your power outliers actually do care about those synergies. And I think Fable does somewhat scale with the environment more than most people give it credit for. Like Adeline is one of my few concessions to really big game cards that make a bunch of game pieces and just go really wide. Fable the Mirror Breaker is one of my concessions to, like, just a great Mull Drifter. Like, this is a card that is a nightmare against targeted removal. Your removal is really not that good against it. And I have leaned over the years much harder into playing cards that are actually bad against removal, like really efficient threats that you remove them efficiently and you feel good about it. This is one of those cards that has a really strong base rate and the like aspirational ceiling of being able to copy stuff with the Reflection of Kiki-Jiki. It's really awesome to get a Kiki-Jiki style effect into a cube where it is actually playable, because that effect is very fun. It's super cool to be able to copy your stuff, and your opponent can see it coming a mile away, and most of the times your Reflection gets removed before you get to activate it. But having that ceiling here also makes it really cool and fun. So this is a card I would currently call probably a 9 or maybe even a 10. It's a card I really love in my cube, and I'm playing at the peaks of power level, so I'm not concerned about it being a power outlier. And that's a card I just completely slept on, along with most of the cube and Magic World more broadly.
I think you said some crazy things right there. I think that this card in like the low-powered synergy type cube that people are trying to get people to play, you know, the discard matters, the madness theme, the whatever, the copying matters. This card is just like, I'm not going to care about any of those themes. This isn't a power outlier that's going to draw me into something. It's just a power outlier that I'm just going to always take and put in my deck.
Yeah, but when you're actually playing the games, it will come up. When you have madness threats in your hand, it will matter. Like, it's a lot different than just having your power outlier be like Ancestral Recall. It's like, all right, great. I have to take this, even though there's a cool synergistic card in this pack for me, because I can't pass this card that is way more powerful and has nothing to do with my synergies. If your cube cares about these synergies, the reason this card is brought up is because it does touch so many synergies. Like, you are going to care about some part of it.
It kind of does nothing. I don't know. I mean, I lump this in actually just because lumping in the commander set a little bit as well. Shorakai, which is this vehicle that just makes 1/1s every turn. It's like this planeswalker you can't kill. This is another power outlier that I see people do the same thing with, where they're like, oh, I want people to play vehicles, so I'm going to put this crazy vehicle in my cube. And if I see that in a cube that is at a lower power trying to draw me into doing synergistic things, I'm just going to take that card and ignore the fact that it has vehicles and just play it.
Well, yeah. I mean, vehicles is a way more narrow theme than caring about discard or caring about artifacts or having any kind of creature you can copy.
That is true.
Like, I totally agree about Shorakai. I see that card and think, okay, great, you want me to play a vehicles deck? I will not.
I will play
a broken
green
control
black deck, and I'm just going to take this card and win every game that
I will just play a broken control deck and use this as a, planeswalker that's even harder to remove. I don't find that Fable plays that way. I don't. First of all, I think its impact is actually like kind of subtle. I think the reason it was overlooked at spoiler season is because it's still kind of like a subtle way to gain advantage in a game. Like, you're still like, all right, I got a couple 2/2s, maybe I increase the quality of my hand a little bit. Like, it is not on its face going to completely take over a whole game. It's going to give you incremental advantage. But also, my point is just that when you actually build your deck and play those games, you are going to run into some of those synergies on the card. It is going to matter. The vehicle text on Shorokai is never going to matter, right? Like, you can just completely ignore that entirely, and it won't matter at all. You're inherently going to run into some of these things, and it means that your decks that are in your cube are going to be winning because of the synergies to some degree, because this card just uses the synergies.
Yeah, I don't know if I totally buy that, but I will say that I think that this is definitely the card that people are most wrong about for both of these directions, because I think there are a lot of people in your camp that just want to play it as a powerful card that sort of didn't realize that the sum of its parts was incredibly, incredibly powerful. And I think there were a lot of designers that, especially after Sam Black called it out, ended up cutting it from lower powered cubes.
I might not call it a Mall Drifter. I might call it a Huntmaster of the Fells, which is like, I know they're
Parker,
the same.
no.
New thought
Parker,
technology
no,
just dropped.
Parker, no, be careful.
Okay.
The keyboard warriors are out there. They're beginning to type. Tiki, 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 tacky, tacky.
I won't say it. I redact that exact phrase.
Please
but
bleep that.
What I will say is that the thing that is most fun about Huntmaster is that all of the value is paying you out in these different currencies. Like, it's not always the case that the 2 life is relevant, or that the wolf token is relevant, or that the 2 damage is relevant, or the fact that it makes your instants a little bit more useful because you can hold them up and flip your Huntmaster. None of those things are guaranteed to matter in any given game, but the value of each of those currencies changes dynamically based on your opponent, based on the game state, based on what turn it is. You know, if you top deck Huntmaster, then all of a sudden you really care about flipping it because it will get big, and also what else were you going to do with your hand of nothing? But early in the game, you might want to value a different part of that card. So in a similar way, I think Fable, yeah, it's powerful, but it manages to obscure the rate by paying you out in these little installments that have very dynamic values.
Maybe another way to describe my defense of Fable the Mirror Breaker is, if you take a cube, synergistic or not, and you're going to have a power outlier in it, that, let's just say there's some objective way to measure the power outlierness with some supercomputer, I would so much rather have that power outlier be a card like Fable the Mirror Breaker than be, you know, Ancestral Recall or Black Lotus, or just some card that is generically great. I hate that feeling when I'm in a draft, which I've actually experienced just now in this roto draft that I'm in the middle of doing, where I'm trying to like draft a focused deck that like has a plan, and then I open a card that is in my colors and just way more powerful than my plan can justify me taking. I'm just, all right, well, there's 3 cards that are really cool for this deck that I have like an idea for what I want to do here, but I'm just forced to take this card that's much more powerful and has nothing to do with what my deck is doing. I don't like that either, and I don't think it's what Fable is. I think it's like, if you're going to have a power outlier, give me a power outlier that at least cares about my synergies, instead of just giving me a raw power outlier that I just have to take because it is really powerful in spite of the fact that it has nothing to do with what my deck is doing.
Like Lelia would be a decent comp here, maybe. Yeah,
Lelia is a good example if you have nothing that cares about impulsive draw or whatever. But yeah, I think that I would much rather have the card with a lot of different little points to tie other cards into, a lot of little points of synergy, than a really powerful card that is just not doing that. Which really, I think, makes Sam Black's comment come down to, hey, don't put huge power outliers in your synergy cubes, right? And if that's what it is, great. But don't blame Fable. Fable's a cool card.
You know, I will say that I did rate it. It is on my survey from several years ago. Now, it is a 3 out of 10, so that's not super great, but it's on there. So I was maybe less wrong than I could have been. That was also a miss for me. Another big miss was... Actually, I didn't miss on the rest of this set. There were a lot of cards.
Great.
Yeah. There were a lot of cards that I cut, like I mentioned earlier, but because I was cutting the package of like artifact baubles. Oh, actually, I did miss that artifact baubles like the Goblin Engineer value loops with various artifacts. Tameshi Reality Architect is another example of that. I thought that deck would be fun, and so I tested all these cards. It's not fun. It drags out the game. It makes the game revolve around this value axis that players really, really like to build, but opponents really, really hate playing against. So I was a little bit wrong about that, and I'm glad I tested it because now I know that it's not something I enjoy. The 2 things that I'm happiest about from this particular set is that I nailed the Wandering Emperor. This was, I don't know if y'all remember the moment in like January of 2022, but like people were talking about how planeswalkers were kind of washed and like Wizards should stop printing planeswalkers and like they're not fun and they don't lead to good cube gameplay. And the Wandering Emperor was so different to me that it signaled that planeswalkers didn't just have to be about accruing tons and tons of value and then ultimate and ending the game. And even more than that, the Wandering Emperor changed the way that combat worked. And combat is one of the most fun parts of Magic. She's the kind of card that can enable bluffing and enable combat tricks at a very high power level. So I really think that not only is she a really healthy power outlier in an Eternal Cube that's playing at the peaks of power, but also just a really novel Planeswalker design in a way that we haven't maybe seen lately. I love the Wandering Emperor.
I agree. I also love the Wandering Emperor. I rated it pretty highly here and still am very high on it. I think it's just such a cool Planeswalker design, and it largely because it doesn't, like so many other Planeswalkers, make the game entirely about itself. It's more like a kind of modal spell in most places, where it's like, all right, I can remove your thing and get a token, or I can get a couple tokens and then just cash this thing in and let it die in combat. Like, it doesn't tick up at a very high rate, and it comes in at relatively low loyalty, which means that you're usually going to get a couple activations out of it, and then it's going to be gone. And so most of the time, it feels like the ways of playing with it are, how do I get the most value out of the activations that I do get, and a lot less about, all right, have a Planeswalker, protect it, and ride it to victory, which you can do here, but it comes up so much less often with this design, I find, than with others.
I think it's interesting looking at the cards that have declined the most. It's a little bit disappointing, actually, just looking at a lot of cards that sort of speak to a very specific dream. So, for example, Hotshot Mechanic, which is this like great pilot for crewing your vehicles. It's easy for me to think of the narrative of people trying this vehicle theme and this being like a really clear call out to it, and it's just not really succeeding. Or another card like Reinforced Ronin, which is this 1-mana 2/2 that returns to your hand. There's a lot you can do with that, and it just, I guess, just never quite lived up to people's dreams, which, I don't know, I wonder if maybe people should give those another try in the future when we have additional cards that, you know, they print in the same standard rotation to work with them. So maybe it's worth reconsidering.
My alternative theory for those two cards is that they look a lot like Savannah Lions and Goblin Guide, and a card like Blade of the Oni, which is the most declined card from Neon Dynasty. All of those cards looked really powerful and then never quite made it in Standard. And I think that might have more to do with it than we would like to admit. Like, we didn't see streamers playing with these cards. We didn't play them when we were playing Arena and playing like Platinum or whatever, like high rankings of Standard play. And I think that matters maybe more than it might appear. I support that argument more in the article, in the main article. So yeah, give it a read. But I do think cards that look powerful and then fail to make an impact in Standard, that's awfully correlated with the cards that decline in play in the Cube world.
All right, Streets of New Capenna. This set was just a big fat stinker from my cube. This set and the accompanying Commander set. I'm going to bring in the Commander set here only because there's exactly two cards I'm playing from both combined. It's Ledger Shredder and Lethal Scheme. Lethal Scheme from the Commander product. I was high on Lethal Scheme, and I still really like it a lot. I think his card is very cool. I will mention one kind of weird complexity of it that I hadn't thought about at spoiler season and has me a little lower on it now maybe, which is the fact that you have to choose the order in which the creatures that you tapped to convoke Lethal Scheme connive, and that decision actually matters quite a bit in a lot of circumstances, and it's a depth of the card that you don't feel until you cast it the first few times, and you're like, oh, okay, I actually have to say which order I'm conniving in, and it really matters what order I put them in, because later on I'm going to have more control over definitely putting a counter on something, but also I will have had to like kind of churn through some cards to get there. It's a weird kind of detail of the card that makes it more complicated than it first looks, and it already looks like a fairly complicated card. On to Ledger Shredder. I think this is the miss I am most embarrassed about across the entire Standard rotation. I did not even rate Ledger Shredder, and it is the only card from Streets of New Capenna that I am playing. To be fair, I only rated 5 cards, and none of them super highly, but Ledger Shredder was a total miss for me. I think I remember even saying at the time that I was concerned that it would be way too defensive, that a 2/4 flyer for only 2 mana would just like shut down aggro too much, and I was worried about that. And in reality, that may be true, but it never comes up because this card is just so good at also attacking. It's extremely good as an aggressive card in like a blue-red spells deck, like Delver-style deck, which is probably my favorite type of deck to support and really lean into in the Bun Magic Cube. And it's actually not that good in a defensive deck. Like, you could play it as a decent blocker in a control deck, and I've done it before, but the thing is, the control decks rarely want to be double spelling, because you want to be holding up mana on your opponent's turn for counter spells and removal spells. Maybe you get to double spell a counter spell and a removal spell on your opponent's turn, but it's a lot more rare than, playing land and saying go, and then playing select answers as they come up. So it's really at its best in a deck that specifically wants to be double spelling, wants to play a second spell the turn it plays a Ledger Shredder, and those decks are much more proactive and aggressive. And in that case, the toughness is really not a, huge wall for the aggro decks. It's just a way to make this a little safer against removal than it would be if it was a 1/2 or a 1/1 that grew similarly. But I've seen this thing with 4, 5, or 6 counters on it in the Bun Magic Cube and just completely demolish games. Continually conniving is so sick in terms of giving you card advantage and card selection. I guess not card advantage. It gives you card selection. It works kind of like Dragon's Rage Channeler in that it continues to make sure you draw gas off the top of your deck. It's probably the card from all of the standard rotation that I am highest on, that I would rate highest right now as I sit here, and I literally didn't even rate it at all during the Streets of New Capenna survey. What a whiff.
That's rough. Again, I rated it a 3, so I'm just a little bit less wrong than you are. But I also think it's pretty fantastic. Obviously, I think this is correlated with the fact that all the pros missed this card. Nobody was talking about it.
I mean, I trusted you when you said it in the article, but I don't remember.
But now that I'm talking to you...
No, I mean, I definitely trust you, but what is your, how much of that is your subjective reference versus some kind of objective analysis of people having missed this card?
Well, I wrote it in the prospective article. 2 years ago at the time, I called out the fact that we missed on this card that was tearing up Legacy, but only after the set's release.
But so was that just Cube designers that missed on it, and the Legacy players pretty quickly figured out that Ledger Shredder was going to be great and demonstrated so?
Nobody was talking about it before the set's release, to my knowledge.
Interesting. And it should be noted, Ledger Shredder no longer viable in Legacy. I have not seen it really in any decks recently, but a lot of cards have been printed since then, and that's just kind of the way things go in Eternal formats.
Yep. I mean, I am reading this article back from 2022, and yeah, it does seem like it was seeing vintage play for a hot second. So maybe it overcorrected and then came back down to a reasonable level where it's seeing modern play and Pioneer play, but less play in those older formats. But yeah, Cube curators really missed on this. I think partly because the constructed players also missed on it.
It's a nearly perfect card for me. The card selection, the fact that your opponents also have to care about it and it changes their sequencing. They don't want to double spell into it if they can avoid it. It's just annoying enough that it makes for interesting decisions, I think. Again, this is probably my favorite card from the entire standard rotation, and embarrassed to say that I saw it, I looked at it, and I was like, ooh, boo, good blocker, boo, and I didn't even think about how good it would be in all of the other circumstances where it's not blocking.
I think my bigger miss from Streets of New Capenna was how excited I was about finishing the Triomes cycle with, Jetmir's Garden and Friends. I didn't rate them 10s, I rated them 7.75s, but I had been thinking that this would fit in with Theseus, which is a cube that really emphasizes 3 and 4 color decks even, heavily multicolor in a way that not all Eternal cubes are. And so this was a big piece of a fetch shock mana base to enable the kinds of turn 2 Scion of Draco plays that can be really fun. But playing all 10 of these in one Eternal cube leads to this weird quirk where no single Triome is extremely valuable. You just want one of them that you can fetch with 4 or 5 fetches, and it automatically just turns on a lot of your deck, or lets you splash the last 2 colors or whatever. And so that range of
Is that what you're supposed to do? I feel like the last couple times I've drafted a cube with Triomes, I've ended up with 3 to 5.
Yeah, absolutely. And Theseus is a cube where I want you to have 3, but I learned after I tested these cards that I really want you to work for it a little harder than just picking up 1 Triome and 5 fetches or whatever, and then whatever shock lands or fast lands happen to wheel. That's not really how I want the mana bases to be constructed. I want a little more intentionality, and I didn't realize at the time that the Triome cycle, as far as my experience, leads to a lot of accidental 5-color mana bases.
Yeah, I mean, I've banged this drum so much, I don't know that I need to reiterate it, but as much as I have been a vocal proponent for the idea that more lands in your cube does not inherently make multicolored decks better than fewer colored decks, and I still stand by that 100%, I think the nature of the lands in your cube has a huge impact on what types of decks are viable. And to me, Triomes, amongst their many offenses to me aesthetically, my biggest gripe with them is that they make it trivially easy to just accidentally end up with a 4 or 5 color mana base that's totally viable, especially if you break singleton for fetch lands, because you just pick one up because, I'm going to be a green-white deck, I guess I'll take Jetmir's Garden, and then all of a sudden you're like, well, actually, now I have 6 red sources without even trying, literally without even like spending a pick on a red source. I just took this green-white land, and so now all these red cards are also free to me, and oh look, another Triome's come along, and now I have 2 Triomes, and my deck can easily splash 2 to 3 additional colors without even trying. I find that play pattern to be just toxic, just really terrible, and it's my biggest issue with the Triomes, broadly speaking, and especially now that we have the Surveil duels, I cannot imagine ever putting a Triome in any of my cubes when you have access to such interesting and powerful, fetchable, typed dual lands.
Absolutely. I mean, with the Surveil lands, I'm probably never going back to Triomes, or maybe, like, I could see myself playing one, just, like, choosing a random Triome and putting it in with the rest of the cube as a treat. Like, you can get the one Triome for that draft, and then next draft it'll be different. I could see myself doing that, but I otherwise agree with you, Andy. Like, I don't have problems with 5-color good stuff. That's a deck I even sometimes want to support. And the density of lands I'm on doesn't really correlate to that. But these particular lands had a play pattern that did contribute to that. And especially like a draft dynamic, not just the play pattern.
And I take them crazy highly when I draft them in any other cube because of this exact reason. It's like a very open first pick because sure, you could play it in any one of 3 different 2-color decks, but it also just, I find the cubes that have them, the 5-color good stuff deck is so often dominant, like Anthony mentioned. Just take as many Triomes as you get, and then all the gold cards that wheel, and as a designer, it's really hard to, I think, make that deck compatible with the rest of your environment, because if there's only 8 drafters, there are going to be some gold cards that nobody else wants, quite literally, and if you just mop up Triomes, fetch lands, and gold cards, it's going to be hard to make sure that that deck is not dominant.
Okay, so maybe last and also least, because Commander Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate had a median of only 2 survivors in the cubes that sent in surveys at the time. I didn't rate any of these cards a 10. I was never fooled by initiative being something that would be like fun to play with. And so, yeah, pretty much all aces on this one for me.
It's funny because I think a different Cube podcast would be talking about this set a lot because the initiative had a huge impact on a lot of people's eternal cubes if you do turn a blind eye to the clunkiness, inelegance of mechanics and just play the most powerful cards, because the initiative was crazy strong and introduced a lot of really powerful cards for those kinds of cubes. I agree, Parker. I never touched them. I only had 2 cards on my maybe list here, neither rated very highly, not playing either at all these days. The only thing I want to note is that I did think Greatsword of Tyr would be more powerful than it ended up being. This is a 1 and a white for an artifact equipment that has equip for a white, and whenever a equipped creature attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on it and tap up to 1 target creature defending player controls. So it's kind of like a territorial Hammer Skull style card, but on an equipment instead of on a creature. I thought this would be pretty good. This felt like it'd be kind of powerful to me because I like the play patterns, kind of in the abstract. I like equipment that doesn't do anything on defense, that encourages attacking. I like the fact that it's interactive. You can use that tap strategically depending on whatever your opponent's got in play. I tested it for a while and it just didn't do enough. It's so slow. The fact that it provides no natural buff, which is why it's only good on attack and not good on defense, but the fact that it provides no natural buff, the fact that, it puts counters on just 1 turn at a time, kind of very slowly, so you're paid 3 mana and waited 2 turn cycles to get even +2/+2 out of it, was just really slow. Like, I think maybe this card could have gotten there on power level if it had, like, if it also gave First Strike or something like that. But, yeah, it was just worse than I thought it was going to be. I thought it'd be more powerful, more impactful, and it couldn't really hang at all in the Bun Magic Cube, power level-wise, regardless of how much I might have liked the play patterns.
You know, I will say that as much as I personally dislike Initiative, and Andy, I think you feel the same, every Initiative card from this set did see increased play, like relative to 2 years ago.
For sure, yeah.
It's just that most of our respondents aren't testing them at all, and the people who
Because
are
we have
open to that play
handsome,
pattern
beautiful,
are playing
intelligent respondents.
Yeah. The minority who is interested in that play pattern are just playing literally every card with the mechanic printed on it. Yeah, what a really powerful and inelegant mechanic.
I'm not surprised that the play rates have increased a lot. I think at spoiler, I don't think most people expected these to be that powerful. Then all of a sudden, White Plume Adventurer was absolutely just wrecking Legacy and, tearing up Eternal formats left and right. And then, a little while later, the very power-focused cube designers out there came around to them and started talking about how powerful they were. So I'm not surprised the play rates are higher, because I think if you were one of those cube designers at spoiler season, you wouldn't have looked at White Plume Adventurer or Seasoned Dungeoneer or Caves of Chaos Adventurer and thought, here's a new staple for my super powerful vintage cube. It would have just kind of seemed forgettable. Those cube designers are out there, and if you enjoy playing those cards, more power to you. Just miss me with that. I'm not here for that kind of stuff.
Yeah, there's also that time where all the commons with the mechanic got banned out of Pauper because people were just double dark ritualing to get these things out on turn one.
It was worth, 4-for-1ing yourself just to have initiative on
Really
turn one
funny.
uncontested. Yeah. Disgusting.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, this set was just kind of a skip for me, and I feel good about that. I made the right choice.
That's exactly where I'm at. I also skipped it. The most played card from this set is Minsk and Boo, Timeless Heroes. If you also want to talk about more cards that have, I think, abominable, egregious designs that, sure, it's powerful, but do you want to play with that? Is that what you want to be doing? A lot of people do, apparently. Most played card on Cube Cobra at rotation. But, I also just skipped this set. I do want to shout out one card that I don't think any of us are very high on, but I know a lot of cube designers really like, which is Gut True Zealot. It's a 2 and a red for a 2/2 legendary Goblin Shaman. Whenever you attack, you may sacrifice another creature or artifact. If you do, you make a 4/1 black skeleton creature token with menace that's tapped and attacking. And then it has a text, choose a background, which we're just going to ignore.
Choose a background.
Yeah, if it didn't have that text, I might think about it a little harder. But I know that a lot of specifically synergy cubes that care a lot about artifacts, have been really high on this card because at first, when you read it, I think a lot of people kind of shortcut the text to, oh yeah, you get this token and then you sacrifice it at the end step. You do not sacrifice it. You just get a 4/1 with Menace that you get to keep forever. And the fact that you can sacrifice non-creature artifacts means that you can, you're not just necessarily upgrading your dinky 1/1 tokens to 4/1s. You're upgrading your Prophetic Prism that already drew you a card, or your Ichor Wellspring or whatever, and doing some synergistic sacrificing.
Some random treasure tokens or something.
Right, just turning random stuff into very reasonable board presence. And I've played cubes where this card has been dominant, and I know this card has a lot of people that really sing its praises. So it would be remiss not to mention it in a set that otherwise, like you mentioned, Anthony, I'm very happy to have just basically skipped this set. I'm not missing anything from this set for my own cubes, but I know this card has got its big champions.
I find the card to really rub your nose in how commandery it is. Again, rub your nose in the fact that it did skip standard legality and modern legality, and so they're able to just throw on the artifact text and also choose a background, because that way you can add a second color to your color identity. It's just I don't know. I'm happy to lose to a 3-drop, but just can it be one that is kind of normal and
Wow. We're really kink-shaming Gut. Be normal. Stop having choose a background written on you.
Yeah, and the unique token and the menace on the tokens, whatever. It
does
fine.
have reminder text for menace, which I appreciate. I think that's cool. But there's a couple aesthetic things that have me way off this card, but I hear the play patterns are very fun for some people.
Quickly going back to Minsk and Boo, you're right that it is the most played card on Cube Cobra, but actually a really interesting quirk is that among our survey respondents, Minsk and Boo Timeless Heroes is declined in play. So
and it wasn't even highly rated at the release either. So listeners, I love you dearly. You're so smart and cool.
But the average rating was 8.2. That was pretty high.
Everyone's allowed to make a mistake and allowed to learn from their mistakes and decide to cut Minsc and Boo Timeless Heroes. Everyone's allowed to do that. If you're out there listening and think, I can't possibly admit to my mistake and cut Minsc and Boo Timeless Heroes, I'm too invested in me being right about this card, you can do it. You can cut it. You're allowed to grow and change.
If we didn't test Fable, then you're allowed to cut Minsc and Boo.
Missing on Ledger Shredder. I remember actually at the time, like when I first picked up Ledger Shredder, which was not that long after I submitted the survey, right? Maybe it was like a month or something passed, and I was like, ooh, actually this card seems good. And I played it, and I remember thinking, man, in like 2 years, I'm going to have to admit that this card was excellent, and I completely slept on it. I thought about this moment when it happened, because I do just so adore Ledger Shredder where I sit today, and yeah, just completely overlooked it.
I was also wrong
really
about
funny.
it, because I looked at it and I was like, ooh.
You thought it'd be okay for the regular
cares
cube.
about double spell, cares about counters, like maybe I'll try this in the regular cube. And then it was like $20 and everybody was like, oh, I'm putting it in my vintage cube and it's destroying everything. And I'm like, no thanks.
I do remember being right about that detail. I remember saying, I think this is way too good for the regular cube.
I'll stick with my
I think
fairy
for the same
vandal.
reasons. I think I was like, it's going to be too good of a blocker. And whatever was going on that month, I was really upset about good blockers and was too worried this was going to be that. So, you live and learn.
I guess we should have mentioned that if our listeners also want to learn how wrong they were, they can visit a tool that we have on luckypaper.co called the Perspective Survey Archive. Let's see, the URL is setperspectives/archive search.
And we'll put it in the show notes, of course.
Yeah, great. You can find out how wrong you were, just like us. Should we, are there any other lessons that we learned from this set rotation, or anything else we should discuss?
I think this rotation, over the span of this 2 years or whatever these sets span, is when I really sort of, I think, dialed in what it was going to be like to curate a cube like Bun Magic for the long term. This is where I sort of, you can see at the beginning, I had so many things rated 10s, and I just had cut them all. And at the end, I had literally 2 cards in the Battle for Baldur's Gate. I had 5 cards in Streets of New Capenna, none of which were rated even remotely highly. I kind of came to learn that, this is a long game. This is a long game, and if I get, a card or 2 cards out of a new set for a cube like this that uses the entirety of Magic's card pool, and for which I have very clear goals and a high bar for inclusion, I don't expect to get very many cards out of new sets, and I sort of came into this realization over the course of this standard rotation. And we can see that growth, I think, in the change in my responses to the surveys, which I gotta say, I was talking about this a little bit with somebody on the Discord a moment ago. I took a big step back from this cube over the past 6 to 9 months, as I have been really deep in the 100 Ornithopters cube and also working a lot on the Neoclassical cube, and just kind of let this sit on the back burner for a while. And God, it felt so good to let it sit on the back burner and then come back to it. And all of a sudden, just the scales fall from your eyes when you really just get out of being so close to it every day. Then I came back and was like, oh, I could cut 12 to 16 of these cards easy tomorrow if I had better kinds of inclusions for them. Whereas I feel like if you're really riding that set to set, gotta stay updated kind of attitude, it's often really hard to find cuts. Everything feels like it's right. So I think
it's a cube is like a non-newtonian fluid. It's like if you're pounding
exactly
at it too
what
much,
it is.
it's rigid and it can't move. You just got to let it relax.
For those that don't know what a non-Newtonian fluid is, I'll put a YouTube video in the show notes.
Don't go do a YouTube video. Go to the grocery store, buy a box of cornstarch, and mix it up with water, and have a good time
Start
with it.
hitting it real hard, and then start
with a
massaging it real slow.
Yeah, that's also how your engine oil works. So, or not exactly, but that's the closest analogy from everyday life. So yeah, thanks non-Newtonian fluids. I guess back on topic, I also feel like I really grew as a curator. I was a lot more sparing with my 10s, especially. And so I think I not only kind of dialed in what are the things that I think will stick around for years to come in my cube, but also learning that I don't have to identify them all before the set is even out. It's okay if I don't pick up a card like Flage, that new Titan, while it's $50. I don't need to be
$50?
so right about it. Something like that. Maybe it's down to 20 or something. But I don't have to get that right now. It's a long haul. I can get Flage once it's reprinted, and I'm still going to enjoy it just as much. I don't have to be right about it before the set comes out, and also pick it up while it's cheap, artificially cheap, whatever you want to call it. It's okay to pace it out, take it slower, kind of wait for constructed to bear out which cards are both fun and powerful for this cube that's operating at a high power level. And it's also okay to disagree with Standard and Pioneer and other results. One of the cards that I enjoy the most relative to how much constructed success it saw was Blade of the Oni. This is, the most declined card from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, but I'm still playing it. And I think actually, Andy, maybe the last time you were playing my cube, you asked me how I felt about it. And I told you I hope it was you, but whoever asked me, I told them my favorite thing about it is that, yes, it's a functional 3/1 while it's attacking, but it has this opportunity to, modify your creature's base stats in a really dynamic way. It's very flavorful, and it doesn't come up often, or it doesn't come up every game for sure. And you could even argue how good that is, but when it does come up, it's really sweet and leads to a lot of emergent synergies. And that's exactly the kind of thing that I play Cube for. And I wouldn't have necessarily known that if I had been updating Theseus with every single set release and always cutting the cards that weren't seeing Standard play to make room for the churn of the new set and the new hype train. So I've just kind of given myself more patience and more ability to wait for the playtests of my own cube without necessarily having to keep up with Standard.
Blade of the Oni reminds me of a specific detail of my own cube curation, which is that for an episode a few months back, I compared the Bun Magic Cube in its current iteration to the iteration when we first started the podcast, I think for our 200th episode or whatever. And something that was really notable to me was how certain slots, certain sort of categories of cards had just a ton of churn, and others had barely any. Like the blue instance, for example, I had basically not cut any. I think I had cut Fact or Fiction, was like the one blue instant I had cut from my cube since starting the podcast, and I had added a couple more and, filled it out a little bit, but there are so many just iconic, eternal blue counterspells and cantrips that I just had never cut and can't imagine cutting. Meanwhile, Black Creatures is an area where I think the only card that was still in my cube from the original iteration was Dark Confidant, and every other Black Creature had changed, most of them many times over. And Blade of the Oni is a card I played for a while. Tenacious Underdog I didn't mention, but was one of the cards I was, again, more wrong about from Streets of New Capenna. It was my highest rated card in Streets of New Capenna. I'm not currently playing it anymore. That's a category of card where I feel like I still haven't quite landed on exactly what I want Black's identity to be in my cube. And if I could answer that question clearly, I could be a lot more confident about what cards would stick around. Whereas I know what I want my blue instance to do. It's a very clear, defined role I want them to play. Whereas my Black Creatures have just kind of constantly been shifting and turning and just a lot of turnover. And so Blade of the Oni is a great example of a card that I played it for quite a while actually, and it was absolutely fine. Why did I cut it? The answer is because I found that it was maybe a little too aggressive for what I want my Black Creatures to be. I don't have enough density of Black Creatures for a base 3/1 menace to really get there. Same honestly goes for Tenacious Underdog. And so I've sort of shifted my Black Creatures now to being more cards that you're happy to have in fewer numbers, where I don't need a lot of creatures in my deck. I just need a couple, and those couple I want to be, cards like Nethergoyf or Dark Confidant or whatever. So it's as much about your vision for your cube and your perception of what you want from your cards as it is about, being correct about your card evaluation, right? I don't think I looked at Blade of the Oni and was wrong about how it would play. I was just wrong about how much I would want that style of card in the Bun Magic Cube for the long term. That does it for our 2024 Standard Rotation Cube Retrospective episode. Now, we do get one of these every year moving forward now, right? They basically, they updated the rotation cycle and, moved it back. So there was one big period where there was no standard rotation for, 2 years. But now we're going to get it every 12 months, correct?
Correct, yeah.
Great.
I think so.
I look forward to the next one of these as well. I'm already sneaking a peek on my survey results page at the cards I was wrong about from Dominaria, United, and other sets, and so there'll be lots to talk about in that time as well. Thanks for taking this walk down memory lane, boys.
Thank you both for the gift of friendship and the gift of
Whoa,
Cube.
whoa, whoa! I haven't done the full outro. I was just, what are you doing?
I was going to
This
snipe
is
it from
chaotic. What the heck? What the heck is this? I haven't even done the full outro. It was just a casual. I guess all the music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the magic cards
right, you
are
do say
produced
that
by.
first.
I say a lot. I do a lot of work on this show. Magic Cards,
can I
Facebook,
jump
Wizards
in?
of the Coast. This podcast is produced by Thinking About Magic Cards and Speaking to Microphones about them. And don't forget, if we were wrong about any of the card text we mentioned on this episode, that was intentionally planted there to bait you into leaving a comment. So don't fall for that bait. Anthony and Parker, thank you for the gift of friendship and the gift of Cube.
Anthony's not being a very good friend by stealing your line.
It's fine. It's good. It's good. It's good radio. If you want to steal that line, I'll come up with a new one.
Hey,
What
I
if you
also
give me
want
half of it? What if we share it?
Oh, man, I listened to a podcast recently where they had that kind of outro where they like kind of went back and forth in like a scripted
Okay,
lines.
you don't like that part? Okay.
I mean, I don't know. We could give it a try. You want to try it on for size right now?
All right. Who goes first?
I think I should go first because I'm leading into it.
Because you're the bigger guy?
No, I do all the other work in the outro. So I'll do the whole like blah 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 blah
Okay, blah, blah, blah.
Produced by Speaking to Microphones, Thinking About Magic Cards. Anthony, thank you for the gift of friendship.
Thank you for the gift of Cube. Yeah, you're right. That's not
Wow.
How
good.
did that feel? How did that feel, Parker?
That was so NPR. I can't even handle it.
Oh, right. I forgot. We're a Joe Rogan podcast now, so we got to work on that energy.
I don't even know how those podcasts end. It feels like they kind of just, they're all like 6 hours long and they just kind of trickle off into the ether.
Everybody falls asleep
I'm
and
not
they
even
just like
sure what
walk
the end of the
out.
Joe Rogan podcast sounds like.
Wait, before we trickle off, I need to thank all of the people who made this article possible and made this episode possible by submitting surveys. I think we've got one open right now. We're about to have another
We
one.
have two open right now by the time this podcast comes out.
Yeah, so continue to submit your data. It really helps when you share your Cube link. And thank you for being a part of this community. And now we can go back to riffing.
Oh, and I guess it's worth mentioning, too, you're like, Parker's on the episode. Where's the Bloomborough Cube Community Set review? I think we've decided to lump that in together with the Duskmore and Cube Community Set review.
Because they're kind of like a diptych, a two-part set.
They
you know,
are,
they're
right?
thematically very tied together. So
I
think
understood
this
them to
makes
be
sense.
that, and the more I see from Duskmore, the more I'm like, is this, where are the cute
The
little
cute animals are in
guys?
there somewhere. They're in the
Like,
house.
It doesn't feel in my bones like they're related. Honestly, it's just that there's too many releases. We just saw a tweet from White Wolf the other day that he is officially stopping doing set reviews probably forever because there's too many sets released and he just is burned out on it. And I'm not going to get to the point where we're just going to quit. I'm just going to do fewer and further between. So we'll get there. We're going to do the Q Community Set review. It's going to happen. Probably lumped in with Duskmorn because there's just too many new cards to talk about. And we're busy making people furious by saying things like chess has a longer planning horizon than poker. Boy, were people mad about that.
Just to clarify, they will be separate articles, just might
Yes.
be the same podcast episode.
Correct. We got to have separate URLs for that search engine optimization.
And also my sanity.